You're watching the Air and Space Channel.
With America and the Soviet Union engaged in a massive arms race, both sides are eager to acquire the technology that will give them a distinct advantage over the other. Bombers, missiles, nuclear-powered submarines and satellites launched into space are all highly sought after during a period where the entire world could be obliterated with the flip of a switch. During this weapons race, Nazi scientists are brought over to both sides of the curtain, where the weapons that at one time were to be used against them are studied and developed further in order to produce a checkmate against the opposing power. The names Werner von Braun, Walter Dornberger and Hermann Oberth are usually mentioned when this topic in history is discussed. For it is their work that gives the United States the X-15, a rocket-powered plane that reaches the edges of outer space and holds the world record for speed, flying at over Mach 6. The X-20 Dynamics Sora, a futuristic space plane that is to be used for multiple purposes, including the bombing of the Soviet Union from outer space. Designs demonstrating America's commitment to be the undisputed champion of Cold War weaponry. And while the names von Braun and Dornberger are etched in stone as the architects of American ingenuity, there is another scientist who is often overlooked by writers and historians. His name is Dr. Jürgen Sanger, a brilliant theoretician who has bigger dreams and aspirations than all the others combined. His ultimate goal is to produce a hypersonic spacecraft that can take passengers around the globe in mere hours. He has a concept that Nazi Germany desires to convert into a lethal weapon to be used against the United States. An idea that is resurrected from the ashes of the Second World War to be used as a game changer for whoever can master its concept. This is the story of Dr. Jürgen Sanger, one of Hitler's spacemen. The story of Jürgen Sanger begins at the turn of the century in the nation of Austria, where as a young child he is infatuated with the idea of man landing on the moon. Like many others from his generation, the idea of space travel galvanizes Sanger, who reads as much science fiction as he can acquire during his impressionable youth. One book in particular that captivates Sanger is Hermann Oberth's Die Rakete zu den Planetenraumen, or By Rocket into Planetary Space, a prolific blueprint of ideas.
He read the books by Hermann Oberth and all the other space travel books. Most of them were science fiction, but that's how he got interested in space travel, going to the moon, going to Mars, and beyond.
There was a lot of great scientists there with fantastic ideas, futuristic ideas. I mean, even Werner von Braun, who did the V2, I mean, his ideas were way ahead of anybody else.
Studying civil engineering at the University of Technology in Graz, he acquires his PhD in what would now be called rocket science. Sanger is a true rocketeer who, like others, must adapt to the new regime that is taking control of Germanic lands. During a period of intense military build-up, where Austria would soon be incorporated into the Third Reich, Sanger begins work on his magnum opus, a high-speed transport plane called Silbervogel, or Silver Bird.
It was his idea in the 30s, mid to late 30s, to build a high-speed passenger aircraft that could fly from Berlin to Tokyo in a matter of hours, or fly from Berlin to New York City in a matter of hours. It had nothing to do with a military aircraft. It had nothing to do with a suborbital rocket bomber. So the Silver Bird started out in Eugen Sanger's mind as a high-speed, high-altitude passenger plane. It's almost similar, I guess the idea would be similar to the Concorde.
When you watch a rocket, when you watch a Saturn V or any rocket take off, you notice it takes off slowly and gradually gathers speed. Well, this is because the most energy in that is involved, more energy than any other aspect of that flight is involved in takeoff. So if you could find a way to make that ramjet, this huge ramjet engine and this huge bomber, take off without using any onboard fuel, you'd really have something there.
There was a debate among the German and Austrian rocket enthusiasts about whether you would use a pure rocket to launch you into space or whether you would use some combination of the airplane and the rocket, using a winged vehicle. So his Silverbird was an idea that he had, was one of many iterations of an idea for this kind of hypersonic or even orbital rocket plane.
It is a revolutionary concept. A vehicle capable of taking passengers from Berlin to Tokyo in mere hours by bouncing off the Earth's atmosphere.
Gravity would eventually want to pull it down. And so what Sanger would do, he'd fire up his 100-ton rocket engine, and he would dive down to about 25 miles altitude, where there's a very dense layer of atmosphere. Now, once this aircraft hit that dense atmosphere, it would bounce off of that, and it would be reflected back up again. It'd be like a child throwing a flat stone across the lake. It bounces along, skipping along. That would be the same principle for Sanger's Silver rocket.
Eugen Sanger developed a concept where you would launch a bomber, a manned bomber, into the stratosphere, into the high reaches, near reaches of space. And then you would re-enter the atmosphere and bounce back up and bounce back down, up and down. And they calculated that you could easily circle the world doing this with their 20-ton thrust Sanger ramjet engine.
While Sanger is not a man of war, his nation is on a path to war.
With all of these guys, you face the same issue that they are space enthusiasts, but they're also nationalists. They're also, in some cases, quite Nazi in their beliefs. So there was no contradiction between their space enthusiasm and being asked to work on rockets as weapons. They saw, on the one hand, rocket weapons, whether it be rocket plane or pure missile, as duty, contribution to the nation, contribution to the Third Reich. At the same time, they saw it as a stepping stone to going into space. So they really didn't see much of a contradiction, if any, at all, between the two.
And very soon, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, a man who will be responsible for Germany's aerial arsenal against the Allies, begins to take a serious look at the possibility of turning the Silbervogel into a deadly state-of-the-art weapon.
The Third Reich was only interested in weapons. The space ideas are all very nice and exotic, but they funded Sanger, they funded von Braun and others because they wanted weapons. They were out to conquer the world, and they needed the weapons to do it.
Although the United States presents itself as a neutral nation, their President Franklin Roosevelt is sympathetic to the nations of England and France. And as the 1930s come to a close, it is almost inevitable that America will enter the war one way or the other. Unfortunately for the Nazis, there is no available aircraft in their arsenal capable of reaching the United States and back to deliver a fatal blow. By 1939, the best means available is Germany's U-boat fleet, who, when given the call, will engage in unrestricted submarine warfare against America's shores. Traditional aircraft known as the America bombers are being designed and built on the fatherland during the war, but remain a giant question mark in terms of range and payload. In a country with a fascination for wonder weapons, spending enormous sums of money on ideas and concepts that in the end may not be realistic at all, it is only natural that Sanger's grand vision is given the green light by German war planners.
When he started working for the Luftwaffe in the late 1930s, I think he looked for a way to sell this idea. The Silverbird was supposed to be a skip bomber, a hypersonic vehicle that would be launched probably from a sled. It would go into a suborbital trajectory, and it could extend its range around the world by essentially skipping off the atmosphere like a rock.
A group of rocketeers are organized and funded by Göring, with research and development to be done at the Hermann Göring Institute located north of Hanover.
Hermann Göring was involved in rocketry, and he saw what the Army was doing with the V1, the V2, and he said, hey, I think I should be involved in this as well. So he started his own group of rocketeers, men who he could find who hadn't been picked up and picked over by Dornberger.
So he started to invent and manufacture power plants, and these were in rocket and pulse jets. And from that he also designed mini fighters with pulse jets, which then led to the idea that perhaps, we could actually go into the atmosphere and have long distances and bomb United States or whatever.
It is there where Sanger and his future wife, Dr. Irene Brett, a brilliant mathematician, begin working on the Silbervogel. On paper, the aircraft is to be launched from a 2-mile-long sled track where rockets will push the Silverbird to over 5,000 feet in altitude.
The Germans decided to use this to put a little vehicle behind this Sanger ramjet bomber that was just tied to the sled, to the electronic sled, and it would push this Silverbird off into the air at a good clip.
He'd have a 2-mile-long monorail that would be pushed along by probably 2-3 dozen of Werner von Braun's V2 rocket engines. At the end of the monorail, the aircraft is going almost 1,200 miles an hour. Once it reached that speed, it would take off at about a 30-degree angle and go up to about 80 to 90 miles altitude.
When the aircraft's power plant ignites, over 600 tons of thrust is generated in a mere 11 seconds. Climbing to over 130,000 feet, the target for its 1-ton payload are the cities of New York and Washington, D.C. Traveling at hypersonic speed, no existing Allied plane or anti-aircraft artillery can touch this Silbervogel on its voyage halfway across the world. After releasing its bombs, this futuristic aircraft will hopefully land on either Japanese territory or on the deck of a U-boat submarine. It is a grand concept, a project that requires years, if not decades, of research and development and vast sums of money in order to complete. Ironically, one of the Silverbird's biggest flaws comes from Sanger himself.
He had a habit, when he ever come up against a problem which he couldn't solve immediately, he would move on to something else. So consequently, Sanger investigated a lot of things, but he jumped around. He jumped from one idea to another, to another, to another.
In studying its design, those in the top German hierarchy have many questions surrounding the aircraft's rocket engine.
With the Silverbird being rocket-powered, there's no plan B for it. Once you ignite the engine, it runs until it runs out of fuel, and you have to. It takes you wherever you have to go, and that's the end. With the supersonic transport, like the Concorde or the SST, I mean, you can turn, you can land, you can refuel, but you could not do that with Sanger's Silverbird. And so, feasible, yes; practical, no.
Also, legitimate concerns are raised about the project's feasibility in a time of war.
The hypersonic vehicle requires an incredibly difficult exotic metal structure in order not to melt. And then you would have the trajectory problem of skipping off the atmosphere is difficult, not impossible, but very difficult. So essentially it was a completely utopian concept for the Third Reich.
This thing flies so high and so fast that how would you even drop the bomb knowing where to drop it and where it's going to hit? For example, the Silverbird, if it went around the world, and that's what it was designed to do, leave Berlin, fly around the world, and on the opposite pole would be New York City. You'd have to drop the bomb somewhere in Iowa. Iowa to New York City is a long, long distance.
He is a visionary, but not a practical man. While the V1 flying bomb and the V2 rocket are thoroughly tested on Peenemünde during the war years, the Silverbird is never able to get past the drawing board.
But it was all really fantastic futuristic ideas which in today's world could be realised. But they were so far ahead of their time that Germany didn't have the capability in terms of facilities, equipment, the technology even was still only on the drawing board. And it would have taken a lot of experimentation to actually realise the ideas.
I mean, this was a paper proposal, and I think in so many of the enthusiast, Nazi exotic weapons concepts that the enthusiasts love, have failed to see just how beyond the technology of the time. I mean, it would be a difficult thing to carry out today, let alone in the 1940s.
By 1942, with the war going in Germany's favour, the Silbervogel is cancelled indefinitely. As the Third Reich faces attacks on two fronts, cuts need to be made, and an enormously expensive space plane is one of them.
Around 1941-42, the Luftwaffe lost interest in this whole utopian project of Zenger, because Zenger wanted to scale up his effort to build a major rocket engine and so forth for his airplane. And that was beyond the ability of the Luftwaffe to commit, especially as the war situation got more and more difficult. And there was essentially a contradiction between spending a lot of money on Zenger for rocket development when there was already a huge rocket project in Germany, the von Braun Peenemünde project.
With the Silverbird's termination, Zenger and Brett are assigned to work on developing ramjet technology for the fatherland. The aircraft appears to be all but dead. 3 years after the project's cancellation, Germany surrenders to the Allies. With both sides closing in from the east and west, Nazi scientists who worked on the Third Reich's wonder weapons become highly sought-after bounty. In the United States, Operation Paperclip is enacted in order to bring these men to America to begin work in their own defense industries. The same people who developed the deadly V-2 rocket that killed thousands during the Second World War now have their slate wiped clean as they begin their new lives, working for their one-time enemy. With tensions escalating as the Soviet Union becomes America's biggest adversary, they will need every advantage possible in order to defeat a regime that soon will possess both the atomic bomb and a delivery system capable of reaching the cities that Germany could never touch. Surprisingly, while hundreds of scientists are rounded up and sent to both sides of the Iron Curtain, Zenger and his wife, Irene Brett, go to neither superpower. Instead, they travel to France to restart their failed research.
Anybody who was picked up by the Soviets post-World War II, for example, if Zenger had been picked up by the Soviets, he had been squeezed like a lemon in order to get whatever knowledge and technology ideas he had out of him. He didn't want to go to the Soviet Union. Now, Zenger did not want to come to America in Operation Paperclip. In fact, he was never invited. Zenger was that small group of scientists in Nazi Germany who felt betrayed that the Americans had beat them, had defeated Nazi Germany, and that they were still mad, still angry with the Americans. And so Zenger, along with a few others, said, I'm not going to work for the Americans. I will not go to America. I'll go to France, where there's a more friendly work environment, and that's where I'm going to continue my career.
With the Soviet victory in 1945, its army begins capturing detailed blueprints of numerous German designs being worked on during the war. When
the Soviets overran Berlin, they overran the Reichsluftfahrtministerium building, and they copied every aircraft design that the Germans had proposed and were proposing to build post-World War II. They had all of these documents translated into Russian, so they knew every aircraft that Germany was working on or was thinking about in the future.
One plane in particular catches the eye of Joseph Stalin.
Stalin seized upon the idea about 1946-47 and was interested in funding it, and because it seemed like the magic answer to figuring out how to attack the United States.
The Soviets wanted Zenger. The Cold War was starting, and they thought, well, maybe one day we're going to have to bomb America, or maybe one day we'll have to bomb Australia. Maybe one day we'll have to bomb any other country around the world. Now, according to the documents that we have here, Sanger's suborbital rocket bomber could bomb any location in around the world. So they said, Stalin says, we got to find Sanger.
The Silver Bird, with all of its unique advantages on paper, appears to be an ideal weapon to use against the United States. And for that reason, he orders a Soviet espionage team headed personally by Stalin's son to kidnap Sanger and bring him to the Soviet Union. The attempt fails miserably.
Well, Sanger was tucked away in France, and although Vasily Stalin could travel all over Europe, he was more of a playboy. He'd go to Paris, and he enjoyed the ladies of the night. He drank heavily, and so it got to the point where he was more interested in the cities he visited and the enjoyment he found than finding Sanger.
It is suspected that the communists lose interest in Sanger's ideas as they discover in the same way that German scientists did that Sanger's plane is unachievable. On the other side of the world, where interest in spaceflight is reaching all-time highs, German scientist Walter Dornberger, who now is working for Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, New York, attempts to recruit Sanger, the same man who Dornberger criticized as a hopeless dreamer.
There was fascination in the United States with Sanger's Silverbird concept, hypersonic flight rocket planes in the 1950s specifically.
His crowning achievement can be seen in America's X-20 Dynamics Sora, incorporating a similar principle to that of his Silverbird design. A revolutionary spaceplane built during the Cold War, it is ultimately cancelled in 1963 due to both money and logistical problems. What becomes the beginning of the end for Iogan Sanger is his decision to go to work for Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Egyptians, developing missile technology. When it is discovered that an ex-Nazi is working for an Arab nation to defeat the Israelis, he is dealt a fatal blow to his career.
For a short time in the early 60s, he was kind of part of a scandal of, old Nazis and working on rockets for the Egyptians against the Israelis.
He was secretly working for Egyptian President Nasser, helping him design long-range missiles that could be fired at Israel. Well, the Israeli Secret Service found out about this, and Sanger's lucky he was never assassinated by these people because they were ruthless. Well, anyway, Sanger was alleged to be earning $500,000 a year from President Nasser. And word got back to German officials, and they didn't know what to do about it. Now, Germany at the time, West Germany, was seeking admission into NATO. And they didn't want any kind of conflict. They didn't want any kind of thing that was embarrassing. They wanted a smooth transition. So they decided that Sanger had to go.
Sanger would spend his final years in exile, dying in 1964.
I had talked with Sanger's son, Hartmut Sanger, several years ago, about this time when he was fired by the German government. Sanger lost all interest virtually in his work, didn't publish, didn't write, didn't speak. He ended up being a broken man, and Hartmut Sanger, his son, said that what had happened to him was the cause of his early death at 59 years of age.
In summing up the career of Iogan Sanger, one can describe him as a utopian visionary unable to turn his ideas into something concrete in the same way Werner von Braun was able to do with the V-2 rocket.
Well, Sanger is certainly an important visionary of the 1920s and 1930s, with some influence on future concepts for hypersonic flight on rocket airplanes, reentry technology. He has influence. He's not technologically, little of what he did actually played out in something familiar that actually got built.
His inability to see things through would relegate his career to that of a theoretician, unable to capture the headlines the same way his colleagues were able to. At the same time, his contribution to rocket technology, to ramjets, to the lifting body, to skip trajectory, and to hypersonic flight can never be ignored. Had his Silver Bird been completed, its impact would have been monumental to whatever country possessed the weapon. For that reason, Dr. Eoghan Zanger, one of Hitler's spacemen, is in the history books as one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century.
You're watching the Air and Space Channel.